Petty Officer Elena Ramirez had never believed in luck. She believed in precision, patience, and discipline. The kind of discipline that came from countless hours lying on her stomach in the dust, her eye pressed against a scope until the world narrowed into a single thin line of crosshairs. Some sailors lived for the thrill of the ocean waves, some for the roar of fighter jets overhead. Ramirez lived for the silence between heartbeats, the stillness before the shot. Her rifle, the .50 caliber Barrett M82, was more than just military-issued equipment. For others, it was a heavy tool, a long-range powerhouse that could take down vehicles or distant targets. For Ramirez, it was something entirely different, an extension of herself. Every bolt she oiled, every barrel she polished, every adjustment she made to the scope was done with the care of a surgeon and the devotion of a believer tending to a sacred relic. The men in her unit joked about it sometimes, whispering to new recruits, "Whatever you do, don't touch Ramirez's rifle. You'll regret it." They laughed, but it wasn't a joke. Everyone learned quickly. Her rifle was off limits. Not because she was unfriendly, but because the bond between a sniper and her weapon was sacred. It wasn't about possession. It was about trust. She had carried that rifle across scorching deserts, damp jungles, and rocky cliffs where a misstep meant death. When her life was on the line, the rifle had never failed her. In return, she never failed it. The first time she truly understood the meaning of that bond had been years earlier, during a mission overseas. She had been tasked with covering a convoy moving through hostile territory. Insurgents had set up ambushes, waiting with RPGs and machine guns. Ramirez had lain prone on a ridge for 10 hours straight, unmoving except for the slow, steady squeeze of her trigger. Every time a shadow flickered too close to the convoy, her rifle spoke with thunder, and danger vanished. The convoy made it through untouched. When her CO congratulated her, Ramirez only glanced at the rifle beside her and whispered, "We did it." That was the kind of relationship she had. Not every soldier understood it, but they respected it. Most of them. At the base where she was now stationed, Ramirez had carved a quiet place for herself. She wasn't the loudest, wasn't the one cracking jokes in the mess hall, and rarely joined in on card games. But everyone knew who she was, the sniper. With eyes like steel, the woman who could hit a moving target from half a mile away in crosswind. Her reputation was both armor and isolation. People admired her, but they also kept their distance. In her quarters, she kept her rifle disassembled, on a padded case when it wasn't in use. Every night before lights out, she'd sit on her bunk and go through her ritual. Check the barrel, wipe it clean, inspect the scope, tighten the fittings, run her hand along the stock as if reading Braille. It wasn't superstition. It was respect. The rifle demanded readiness, and she honored it. One evening, a young ensign named Jacobs made the mistake of asking the wrong question. Watching her clean the massive weapon, he smirked and said, "You love that thing more than people, don't you?" Ramirez didn't even look up. She continued wiping the scope, her voice flat but steady. "People don't always do their job. This rifle does." Jacobs never brought it up again. Despite her reputation for coldness, Ramirez wasn't heartless. She cared deeply for her unit in her own quiet way. She watched their backs in combat, taught rookies how to breathe through the scope, and stayed up late helping troubleshoot jams or misfires. But there was a line between camaraderie and trust, and no one crossed it when it came to her rifle. It wasn't a matter of arrogance. It was survival, carved into her through experience. The rifle had saved her life more than once. There was the time in Afghanistan when she spotted the glint of an enemy sniper scope just before he fired. She had less than 2 seconds. Her rifle boomed, and the glint vanished forever. Another time, pinned behind crumbling walls with her squad under fire. Ramirez had picked off enemy gunners, one by one, until silence reclaimed the battlefield. Each memory reinforced the truth. Her rifle wasn't just a tool. It was her lifeline. That morning, the sun rose over the base in streaks of gold and crimson. Ramirez was already awake, seated on a bench near the range, her rifle across her lap. She polished the stock, the metal gleaming in the light. Around her, the base stirred. Soldiers heading to breakfast, mechanics warming up engines, the smell of diesel and sea salt blending in the air. But Ramirez sat still, lost in the quiet ritual that started her day. Captain Harlow, her direct superior, approached with a steaming cup of coffee. He didn't say much, just nodded at her. They had served together long enough that words weren't always necessary. He knew what that ritual meant to her, and he respected it. "You'll hear the news soon," Harlow said finally, sipping from his mug. Ramirez glanced up. "What news?" "Admiral Kane's coming for inspection today." She raised an eyebrow, the faintest sign of curiosity. Admirals rarely set foot in forward bases unless there was something to prove. Kane was a name everyone knew, a man with a reputation for being sharp, demanding, and some whispered arrogant. Ramirez returned her gaze to the rifle, running a cloth along the barrel. "Doesn't matter who comes. My rifle stays mine." Harlow gave a short laugh. "Let's just hope he doesn't test that." The rest of the morning passed in a haze of preparation. The base was scrubbed clean. Vehicles lined up like parade floats, and soldiers marched in practiced formation. Ramirez watched with quiet detachment, her rifle strapped to her back. Inspections were never her favorite. They were about appearances, polish, and ceremony, things that mattered little when bullets started flying. Still, she respected the chain of command, even if she didn't agree with its theatrics. As the sound of helicopter rotors thundered across the sky, Ramirez felt a strange chill. The Admiral's arrival wasn't just routine. It carried weight. She couldn't shake the feeling that the day ahead wouldn't be ordinary. The helicopter touched down, dust swirling across the tarmac. Out stepped Admiral Kane, tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform pressed to perfection, medals gleaming in the sunlight. His sharp gaze swept over the assembled ranks like a hawk surveying prey. Soldiers stiffened as he passed, boots clicking, breaths held. Ramirez stood in formation, rifle slung across her chest, eyes forward. She didn't flinch under his stare, though she felt the weight of it pause on her for a second longer than on others. Something in his eyes told her he wasn't just inspecting. He was looking for something, or someone to challenge. And Ramirez knew deep down that it was only a matter of time before he found it. The atmosphere on base was different that morning. Everyone felt it, even those who tried to mask it behind routine. The air seemed charged, buzzing with the knowledge that Admiral Kane was coming. For soldiers stationed on the edge of conflict, admirals weren't a daily sight. They were figures from stories, names stamped on orders, faces occasionally glimpsed on official screens. For one to visit in person meant something important. It also meant tension. Petty Officer Elena Ramirez noticed the change long before she saw the Admiral's helicopter cut through the sky. Marines rushed to scrub mud from vehicles, engineers polished tools, and sailors tugged at their uniforms as if an extra crease might save their careers. Commanders barked sharper orders, officers double-checked formations, and the mess hall suddenly served breakfast with suspicious perfection. Eggs not burned, coffee not watery. To Ramirez, it was theater. Necessary, perhaps, for politics and chain of command, but theater nonetheless. She kept to her routine, refusing to let the nervous energy infect her. In her barracks, she sat with her rifle, cleaning every part as carefully as always. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't panicked. She was steady. Her rifle gleamed beneath the soft glow of the overhead light. She oiled the bolt carrier, checked the suppressor, and then tested the trigger pull with a click. So soft only she could hear it. The rifle's weight in her hands reminded her who she was. Admirals could come and go. Inspections could rise and fade. But the one constant was this weapon. It was her equalizer, her voice, her guardian angel when the world went dark. Outside, soldiers called to one another as trucks rolled into neat rows. Ramirez could hear the shouting of her CO, Captain Harlow, keeping everyone sharp. He was a good leader, tough but fair, with the kind of grounded presence soldiers trusted when things went bad. She knew even he felt the pressure of Kane's visit. By the time Ramirez stepped outside, uniform crisp, rifle slung across her chest, the base was spotless. Vehicles glistened in the sun. Equipment lined up like museum pieces. Soldiers stood in formation, shoulders square, eyes forward, boots planted as if rooted in concrete. The air carried the scent of oil, metal, and ocean salt. Then came the thrum of rotor blades. A shadow spread across the parade ground as the Admiral's helicopter descended. Dust kicked up in swirling clouds, forcing soldiers to squint against the sting. Engines roared, then whined to silence as the craft settled. The side door opened with a mechanical hiss, and out stepped Admiral Kane. He was taller than Ramirez expected. Broad-shouldered, with a posture that radiated command, he moved with the sharp precision of someone who expected the world to shift out of his way. His uniform looked like it had been pressed only seconds earlier, every metal gleaming like a thing, star against the blue fabric. His cap sat perfectly aligned, his expression set in a stern mask. Silence fell over the base as Kane surveyed them. His eyes were sharp, cold, and calculating, flicking from soldier to soldier with the kind of judgment that made even hardened veterans feel inspected down to the bone. He said nothing at first, only walked down the line, boots clicking, hands clasped behind his back. "Discipline looks strong," he finally said, his voice carrying across the ranks. "Equipment polished, formation tight. I expected nothing less." Ramirez could sense the wave of relief ripple through the soldiers. An admiral's approval, even a small nod, meant something, but Kane wasn't finished. His gaze swept again, and this time it lingered. It stopped on Ramirez. For a long second, his eyes locked onto her rifle, the massive .50 cal slung neatly across her chest. It wasn't unusual for him to inspect weapons, but something in the way his stare lingered unsettled her. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She simply let the rifle rest where it belonged, steady and untouchable. Kane broke eye contact and continued down the line. Soldiers relaxed slightly, though not too much. No one knew what the Admiral might demand. After the inspection, Kane moved toward the equipment displays. Soldiers had laid out everything from small arms to heavy ordnance. Mortar gleamed, sidearms shone. Rifles stood stacked like soldiers themselves. He stopped often, asking quick questions, testing officers with sharp quips. When he reached Ramirez's unit, her rifle was displayed on a padded stand, its black barrel gleaming in the sun like a predator at rest. Kane paused. "This one," he said, voice low but carrying. "The Barrett .50 caliber. Who handles it?" Ramirez stepped forward with a crisp salute. "Petty Officer Ramirez, sir." Kane's eyes flicked between her and the rifle. "Your weapon?" "Yes, sir." "Issued to me, maintained by me." "Impressive machine," Kane muttered, stepping closer. He circled it slowly, like a hawk circling prey. "I've seen these tear holes through walls, and battles before they begin." Ramirez remained silent. The Admiral's words weren't for her to agree or disagree with. She simply stood at attention, spine straight, rifle stand before her. Kane leaned closer, studying the scope. He crouched slightly, examining the barrel, the bipod. His gloved fingers brushed against the stock. Ramirez's heart tightened. Protocol dictated she remain motionless until ordered. But every instinct screamed at her. Her rifle wasn't a museum piece for inspection. It wasn't something to be pawed at like an artifact. It was her lifeline, her partner. She tried to will herself calm. Perhaps he was only looking. Perhaps he'd step away. But then, without warning, his hand moved toward the scope, fingers curling as if to grasp it. Ramirez's jaw clenched. Around her, she felt the sharp intake of breaths from fellow soldiers. They all knew what this meant. No one touched her rifle, not even a commander, especially not an admiral. And yet, Kane's fingers made contact. They rested lightly on the scope at first, as though testing its steadiness. Then, slowly, his grip tightened, twisting it slightly to the side. That was when Ramirez's restraint snapped. Her arm shot out with lightning speed, hand closing around Kane's wrist. Gasps broke from the ranks as her fingers locked down. She snapped his hand downward in a sharp, controlled motion. Not enough to injure permanently, but enough to jolt, enough to sting, enough to send a message. Kane's eyes widened in shock, a flash of pain crossing his face. Soldiers froze. The air itself seemed to stop moving. Ramirez stood her ground, her hand still gripping the Admiral's wrist, her eyes locked on his. Her voice was steady, calm, and cold as steel. "With respect, sir, no one touches this rifle but me." The silence that followed was heavier than any gunfire she'd ever heard. For the span of a heartbeat, the base became silent. Not the usual quiet of discipline, but a stunned silence, sharp, brittle, and heavy enough to crush the air from every chest. Every soldier froze where they stood. The whine of a distant generator, the clatter of a loose chain somewhere on the motor pool fence. Even the gulls circling above the bay seemed to hush in that moment. All eyes were locked on the impossible sight before them. A petty officer gripping the wrist of a decorated admiral. Admiral Kane's face betrayed more shock than pain. His eyes, cold and calculating only moments before, widened with disbelief as Ramirez's fingers clamped his wrist with soldier strength. She hadn't wrenched hard enough to break it, but the sharp snap downward made the Admiral stumble half a step. His other hand instinctively curled into a fist, though he stopped himself from striking back. The soldiers in formation held their breath. No one dared move. Some darted quick glances at Captain Harlow, who looked pale but rigid, torn between intervening and letting the moment play out. To interrupt could mean disaster. To stay silent could mean worse. Ramirez's grip didn't waver. Her eyes, sharp as the crosshair she lived behind, locked with Kane's. She wasn't reckless, wasn't trembling, wasn't apologizing. She was calm, deadly calm. Her voice cut the silence like a knife, steady and firm. "With respect, sir, this rifle is not for display. It is not a prop. It is my life. And no one, not even you, touches it." The words echoed across the parade ground, low but clear. A murmur rippled through the ranks, quickly stifled as Kane's glare shifted, silencing even whispers. His jaw tightened. He was not a man used to being challenged, especially not in public, especially not by a lower-ranking officer. The authority of his uniform, the weight of his medals, the years of command under his belt, all of it had just been snapped, like a brittle twig in front of 100 watching eyes. For a few terrifying seconds, Ramirez wondered if she had gone too far. Career-ending reprimands, demotion, prison, all of it was possible. She knew the consequences as clearly as she knew her rifle's recoil. But she also knew something more important. If she let the Admiral treat her weapon like a toy, she'd betray everything she stood for. Finally, Ramirez released his wrist. Slowly, deliberately, the Admiral pulled his hand back, flexing his fingers. The skin around his wrist was already reddening. The standoff wasn't just about flesh and steel anymore. It was about pride. Captain Harlow finally found his voice. He stepped forward, saluting. Sir Petty Officer Ramirez meant no. Silence, Kane snapped, his tone sharp as broken glass. Harlow froze, his salute still raised, sweat trickling down his temple. Kane turned back to Ramirez, his eyes narrowing. The air seemed colder now, each breath more difficult. Ramirez braced herself. If he wanted to end her career on the spot, he had the power. One word, and she'd be stripped of rank, thrown out, her years of service erased. But instead of fury, something else flickered across Kane's face. Curiosity. Challenge. You hold your weapon in high regard, he said slowly, each word deliberate. Enough to put your career at risk. Enough to put your life at risk. Ramirez didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was an answer. Kane's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. More like the edge of a blade. He straightened, his voice rising again for all to hear. Then prove it. The soldiers shifted uneasily, glancing at one another. Prove it? What did that mean? Kane raised his uninjured hand and pointed toward the range, where steel targets glimmered in the distance. 6 targets, different distances, whined against you. 1 rifle, 6 rounds. Show me you deserve the bond you claim. The challenge hung in the air, like a thundercloud. Harlow opened his mouth, perhaps to protest the insanity of such a public trial, but Kane silenced him with a glance. The Admiral's authority was absolute, and no one dared to counter him. All eyes turned to Ramirez. The entire base seemed to lean toward her, waiting for her response. Her pulse slowed. She let the Admiral's words sink in. 6 targets, 1 rifle, 1 chance. It wasn't just a test of skill. It was a test of defiance. If she failed, she'd be humiliated. He'd use it as proof that she was reckless, insubordinate, undeserving. If she succeeded, well, perhaps even an admiral would have to respect her. Ramirez gave a single sharp nod. Yes, sir. The tension didn't break. It only deepened. Soldiers whispered behind their teeth as Kane gestured toward the range. Ramirez stepped forward, her boots crunching against gravel. Her rifle was heavy on her shoulder, but to her it felt like part of her body, like muscle and bone. The range. Officers scrambled to set the targets. 6 steel plates of varying sizes staggered between 300 and nearly 1,000 yards. The wind carried sharp off the ocean, tugging at flags and rattling loose chains. It was far from ideal shooting conditions, which was exactly the point. As Ramirez knelt beside her rifle, setting it onto its bipod, she felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The eyes of every soldier, the gaze of the Admiral, the pounding of her own heart. But she breathed slow, steady. She had done this before. Dozens of times. Hundreds. Combat didn't allow for nerves. Neither would this. The Admiral stood with arms crossed, his bandaged wrist tucked against his chest. He watched her closely, no longer dismissive, but measuring, calculating. Ramirez looked through the scope, adjusting for distance and wind. The crosshairs danced faintly in the sea breeze, but her hands were steady. She blocked out the murmurs. Behind her, the presence of Kane, the risk to her career. There was only the rifle, the wind, and the target. Her finger brushed the trigger, and in that instant, before the first shot rang out, Ramirez understood. This wasn't just about proving herself to an admiral. It wasn't about saving her, career or her reputation. It was about showing everyone and herself why no one ever had the right to touch her rifle. The moment Admiral Kane's gloved fingers curled around the scope, the world seemed to stop. To anyone else, it might have been a simple gesture, the absent-minded curiosity of a commander admiring his troops' weapons. But to Petty Officer Elena Ramirez, it was sacrilege. That scope wasn't just glass and steel. It was her eye, her reach, her survival. He might as well have pressed a hand to her heart. Her instincts took over before reason could interfere. Ramirez's hand shot out, gripping Kane's wrist with a speed that startled everyone, even herself. The Admiral's hand was larger, his skin pale against the weather-worn tan of hers, but she had leverage. With one sharp downward twist, she snapped his wrist out of place on the rifle, forcing his fingers to let go. It wasn't enough to break bone, but the sting made his eyes flash with both pain and disbelief. Gasps erupted from the ranks. A dozen soldiers nearly flinched out of formation. Someone muttered, "Holy hell!" under his breath before being silenced by his neighbor's elbow. No one touched an Admiral. No one. Ramirez held the grip a second longer than necessary, her gaze locked on Kane's eyes. He expected to see fear, an apology, panic at her career slipping through her fingers. But there was none. Her expression was calm, controlled, deliberate. When she finally released his wrist, it wasn't out of guilt. It was out of choice. Kane straightened slowly, flexing his fingers as though testing for damage. His jaw tightened. His nostrils flared, and for a brief moment it looked as though he might lash out, verbally or otherwise. His reputation preceded him. Everyone knew he had buried careers over smaller acts of defiance. Captain Harlow took a nervous step forward, his voice sharp but shaking slightly. "Sir, Not a word, Captain." Kane cut him off, his voice low and dangerous. The look he gave Harlow froze the officer in place, saluting rigidly like a man awaiting execution. The silence thickened again. Soldiers stood like statues, though sweat glistened down temples, and a few throats bobbed nervously. Everyone knew what was coming. Kane would explode. He would tear Ramirez apart in front of them all, strip her rank, and leave her career in ashes before lunch. But he didn't. Instead, he studied her. Slowly, calculatingly. His sharp eyes scanned Ramirez's face, searching for weakness, the twitch of guilt, the tremor of regret, anything to confirm she had acted in the heat of foolishness. He found nothing. She stood like a rock, hands by her side, rifle gleaming. On its stand, posture unshaken. "With respect, sir," Ramirez said finally, her voice low but carrying across the courtyard, "this rifle is not for display. It is not a trinket. It is my life. No one touches it but me." The words struck like rounds fired in the air. Every soldier heard them. Every soldier knew the weight of them. It wasn't arrogance. It was creed. Ramirez wasn't protecting ego. She was protecting the bond between a sniper and the weapon that kept her breathing. Kane's lips pressed into a hard line. For a moment, his face flushed, pride warring with protocol. He had been humiliated in public by a junior enlisted. The kind of act that could ripple through a chain of command like a virus. If he punished her brutally, it would prove his authority. But it would also reveal he'd lost control of the situation. If he ignored it, it would look weak. He needed another way, so he found one. "You think you and that rifle are one," Kane said, his voice sharp, resonant, forcing everyone to hear. "Fine. Prove it." Murmurs swept through. The formation. Prove it? What did that mean? Kane gestured toward the range behind them, where steel targets gleamed under the midday sun. 6 targets. Different ranges. Crosswind strong enough to pull bullets sideways. 6 shots, no misses. If you're as inseparable from that rifle as you claim, then you'll make everyone count. The soldiers shifted nervously, but no one dared speak. Ramirez didn't move at first. She let the challenge settle. She understood what he was doing. This wasn't just about marksmanship. It was about humiliation. If she missed even once, Kane would have his proof. She was reckless, unworthy, nothing more than a stubborn soldier who disrespected her chain of command. But if she succeeded, she drew in a slow breath, squared her shoulders, and spoke clearly. "Yes, sir." A spark of approval flickered in Kane's eyes, quickly hidden behind steel. He turned sharply to the range officer. "Set them up. Spread them far. Make the last one dance in the wind." The officer saluted and hurried off, shouting commands. Within minutes, 6 steel plates were raised at staggered distances. The nearest sat at 300 yards, the farthest nearly 1,000, swaying faintly under the coastal wind. It wasn't just a test of precision. It was a trial by fire. Ramirez stepped forward. Her boots crunched against the gravel, each step echoing louder than the last in the silence of the watching base. Soldiers turned their heads subtly, following her with their eyes. She felt their doubt, their curiosity, their unspoken questions. Would she really risk everything? At the firing line, Ramirez lowered herself to the ground. She unfolded the bipod, settled the stock against her shoulder, and lowered her cheek to the scope. The rifle felt right, heavy, solid, unshakable. It always had. The wind tugged at her hair, whistling across the range. She adjusted for it instinctively, fingers twisting the scope dial, muscles aligning with years of training. She slowed her breathing, let her heart settle. Around her, the world faded. There was no Admiral, no audience, no career on the line. There was only the rifle and the target. Behind her, Kane crossed his arms, his bandaged wrist pressed close to his chest. His face was unreadable, but his eyes burned with a mix of scrutiny and challenge. Soldiers leaned forward ever so slightly, their formation rigid, but their curiosity impossible to hide. Ramirez exhaled slowly. The crosshairs steadied. Her finger curled against the trigger. And as the first shot broke the silence, she knew one truth with absolute certainty. Whether she rose or fell after this moment, no one would ever forget why she defended her rifle. A parade ground had never been this quiet. Hundreds of boots stood rooted, hundreds of eyes fixed on the prone figure of Petty Officer Elena Ramirez. Even the wind, sharp off the sea, seemed to hush in anticipation, carrying only the faint metallic rattle of distant flagpoles. Ramirez lay perfectly still, her rifle nestled into her shoulder, the cold steel bipod biting into gravel. She adjusted the cheek weld, pressing her face against the stock, eyes locked through the scope. The world narrowed to a circle of glass, crosshairs and steel plates shimmering in the midday sun. Behind her, Admiral Kane stood with arms crossed, his bandaged wrist tucked under his elbow. His expression was carved stone. No anger now, no frustration, only the hawk-like intensity of a man measuring another. Captain Harlow lingered at the edge of the scene, lips pressed tight, fists clenching and unclenching. He knew how much was at stake. Ramirez wasn't just firing at plates. She was firing at her career, her future, and perhaps even her freedom. The range officer's voice broke the silence, sharp and clipped. 6 targets set. Distances: 300, 450, 600, 750, 800, and 980 yards. Shooter ready. Ramirez inhaled slowly, filling her lungs with salty air. She could feel the weight of every eye on her, but inside she was elsewhere. The battlefield, the ridgelines, the lonely watch where her only company was the scope and the sound of her heartbeat. "Shooter ready," she replied, her voice steady. "Fire when ready." The order dissolved into silence again. Through the scope, the first target loomed large, a steel plate at 300 yards. For a sniper like Ramirez, it might as well have been a barn door. The wind pushed at the grass, but she compensated with a subtle twist of the dial. Her mind calculating instinctively. Her finger caressed the trigger, pressure building, breath held at the bottom of her lungs. Crack! The rifle roared, echoing across the base. Soldiers flinched at the sound, ears ringing even with plugs. A heartbeat later, the plate sang with a sharp metallic clang and fell backward into the dirt. Cheers threatened to erupt, but were smothered instantly. Soldiers bit their tongues, holding formation. Still, the spark of awe flickered in their eyes. Ramirez didn't celebrate. She reloaded smoothly, her hands a blur of practiced precision. The rifle's kick, the roar, the target falling, all of it slid past her like rain on glass. There were 5 more to go. The second target, 450 yards. Smaller, harder. She adjusted again, her breathing slowing. The wind gusted, tugging the crosshairs just off center. She waited. Snipers didn't fight the wind. They waited for it to settle, then struck. She squeezed. Crack! The bullet tore through the air, a whisper of death no one could see. The plate rattled violently, tipping backward with a crash. Another hit. Now murmurs spread through the ranks despite discipline. 2 for 2. Even seasoned shooters missed under pressure, and this was no ordinary pressure. Ramirez was firing, with her career dangling over her head. Kane's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. He had expected confidence. He hadn't expected composure. The third target, 600 yards. The wind was stronger here, the distance unforgiving. Ramirez exhaled, let her pulse slow, and pressed into the stock until her world became nothing but crosshairs and steel. The shot thundered. The plate fell. The murmurs grew louder, harder to contain. 3 shots. 3 perfect hits. For the first time, Ramirez let herself blink slowly, centering her mind. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't rattled. She was calm, strangely calm. She remembered a phrase from sniper school. When the world holds its breath, the rifle will speak. Today, the world was silent. The fourth plate stood at 750 yards, smaller still. The wind pulled hard at this range, dragging the bullet sideways in invisible currents. Ramirez dialed the scope, adjusted her posture, and waited for the briefest pause in the gusts. She squeezed gently. Crack! The steel rang like a bell, tumbling into the dirt. A few soldiers couldn't contain themselves. 4, one hissed, quickly silenced by his sergeant's glare. The excitement was palpable now. No one dared cheer, but electricity surged through the formation like a current. Kane's jaw flexed. His arms tightened across his chest. A bandaged wrist throbbed faintly, but he ignored it. What mattered was the sniper on the ground, proving herself round by round. The fifth plate was brutal 800 yards. Crosswind screaming, the steel barely visible against the wavering horizon. Ramirez could feel sweat bead on her temple, but she didn't blink it away. She couldn't risk breaking the rhythm. Her breathing slowed. She inhaled, held, exhaled. Half. Crack. For half a heartbeat, nothing. Clang. The plate toppled. This time, the ripple of excitement broke discipline entirely. Several soldiers whispered, some muttered prayers, others grinned outright. 5 for 5. Perfection. Kane's mask faltered for just a second, his lips tightening into the faintest grimace. He masked it quickly, but Ramirez saw it through her scope's periphery. He was realizing this wasn't luck. This was mastery. The sixth target waited at nearly 1,000 yards, swaying gently in the wind. The most difficult shot of them all. Soldiers leaned forward slightly, unable to help themselves. Even hardened veterans knew this distance tested the best. Ramirez felt her heartbeat. Slow. Heavy. She had made this shot before, in training, in combat, but never with the weight of an admiral's challenge, never with an entire base watching. She adjusted. Click, click. The scope dial whispered under her fingers. She calculated holdover, adjusted for drop, felt the wind tugging. Time stretched thin. She inhaled, held. The world stilled. Crack! The recoil kicked into her shoulder. Through the scope, the bullet seemed to fly forever. A shimmer of heat, a flicker of wind, and then clang. The steel plate spun violently, crashing into the dirt. Silence shattered. The formation erupted with cheers, discipline collapsing under the roar of disbelief and awe. Soldiers clapped, shouted, some even stomped their boots. 6 for 6, every plate down. Not a single miss. Ramirez lowered her rifle, rolling it gently onto its side. She didn't pump her fist. She didn't smile. She simply sat up, her face calm, her breathing steady, her rifle resting beside her like an old friend. The base erupted, but Admiral Kane stood perfectly still. His face was unreadable, though his eyes burned with something new. Not anger, not humiliation, but respect. Hard-earned, grudging, undeniable respect. When the noise finally died down, Kane stepped forward. The crowd parted instinctively, leaving only the Admiral and Ramirez facing each other. "You've made your point," Kane said finally, his voice low but carrying. He flexed his bandaged wrist, then lowered it. "No one touches this rifle again." Ramirez gave a crisp salute. "Yes, sir." The soldiers stood in stunned silence. They had witnessed something more than marksmanship. They had seen defiance transformed into proof, into respect, into legend. And though no one said it aloud, every man and woman there knew they would carry the story with them, retelling it wherever sailors and soldiers gathered. The day a petty officer snapped an admiral's hand and proved her rifle was more than steel. It was life. The cheers from the formation still echoed across the range, raw and uncontrolled, before discipline snapped back into place. Sergeants barked their men into silence. Officers hissed for order, and one by one the voices tapered off until only the restless wind filled the gap. But the silence was different now. It wasn't the silence of fear like before, when Ramirez had twisted the Admiral's wrist. It was the silence of awe, of respect, of something witnessed that would be remembered long after boots left that parade ground. Ramirez rose from the prone position with slow precision, cradling the point, .50 cal in her arms. She dusted the gravel from her sleeve and stood tall, rifle resting casually against her hip, as though she hadn't just pulled off what most shooters considered impossible. Her face betrayed nothing. No pride, no smugness. Just the same quiet. Resolve that had always carried her through firefights and training grounds. Admiral Kane stepped forward. The crowd parted instinctively, opening a clear path between the two figures. The Admiral's boots crunched against gravel, his uniform immaculate, his posture regal despite the faint stiffness in his bandaged wrist. He stopped a few feet from Ramirez, eyes locked on hers. For a long moment, no one spoke. It was Kane who finally broke the silence. His voice carried across the assembly, sharp and deliberate. 6 for 6. The words were simple, but the weight of them pressed heavily on every ear. You've proven you can shoot, petty officer. No one here will deny it. He glanced at the fallen plates in the distance, his tone edged with something almost grudging. But marksmanship is only part of the equation. A sniper doesn't just fire at steel plates. A sniper fires at men who move, who fight, who hide, who shoot back. The murmurs rippled again, but quieted quickly. Kane's eyes narrowed. So here's my question. Can you perform when the pressure isn't just about accuracy, but about survival? When the battlefield throws chaos in your Face, and you don't get 6 perfect setups in a row? The challenge hung in the air like a blade. Captain Harlow looked as though he might faint. His jaw clenched and sweat streaked his temple. He knew Kane wasn't finished. Sure enough, the Admiral stepped back, raising his voice. Targets are one thing, combat is another. If this rifle is truly your life, petty officer, then show us you can wield it in combat conditions. Right here, right now. Gasps rippled through the formation. Soldiers shifted uneasily in their boots. The challenge was dangerous, maybe even reckless. No admiral should have been pushing an enlisted to perform like this in front of hundreds. But Kane wasn't looking for approval. He was looking for dominance. Ramirez tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanged. Define the conditions, sir. Her voice was calm, measured, as though he'd asked her whether she wanted coffee or tea. Kane's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles. Predatory, but intrigued. This wasn't defiance for its own sake. She was calling his bluff, asking him to formalize the challenge so she could dismantle it piece by piece. Very well, Kane said, gesturing to the range officer. We'll set moving targets, pop-ups, random timing. 6 again, different ranges. You'll have 30 seconds per target. Miss, and it counts against you. Miss twice, and you've proven nothing. The murmurs grew louder now. Soldiers exchanged glances, whispering under their breath. Pop-ups were notoriously difficult. Targets that appeared and disappeared in random patterns, forcing shooters to react instantly. No time to settle, no time to breathe. And at this range? With the wind pulling sideways? It bordered on impossible. Harlow stepped forward, his voice taut with restraint. Sir, with respect, this isn't standard procedure. Kane cut him off, voice like a blade. Standard procedure doesn't apply when someone claims their rifle is untouchable. We're beyond procedure now, Captain. We're testing conviction. Harlow froze, lips pressed into a tight line. He couldn't defy a direct superior. All he could do was step back, his eyes flicking toward Ramirez with silent warning. Be careful. Ramirez crouched, set her rifle down, and calmly began reloading. Her hands moved without hesitation, pulling fresh rounds from her kit, sliding them into the magazine with smooth, deliberate clicks. She didn't look at Kane. She didn't look at Harlow. She didn't even look at the crowd. Her focus was singular. The rifle. The rifle never betrayed her. The rifle never disrespected her. The rifle never questioned her worth. She chambered around, the metallic snap carrying like a thunderclap in the tense silence. I accept your conditions, Admiral, she said, her tone as level as her breathing. 6 targets. 30 seconds each. Miss twice, I fail. Her. Words rolled across the formation, steady and resolute. Soldiers straightened unconsciously, as if her composure demanded their own. Kane nodded once, his eyes glittering. Then prove it. The range officers scrambled, resetting the system. Mechanized targets were dragged into place, tracks adjusted, timers wired. 6 stations gleamed under the noon sun, each set to rise and vanish unpredictably at distances ranging from 400 to 900 yards. It took 15 minutes, but no one moved from their spot. The entire base seemed frozen in anticipation. When the setup was complete, the officer in charge saluted sharply. Ready on the line, sir. Kane didn't even look at him. His eyes stayed locked on Ramirez. Shooter ready? Ramirez dropped prone again, the bipod locking into gravel, the scope dial turning under her fingers. She settled into the rifle, like it was an extension of her body. Shooter ready. Kane's voice rang out. Commence. The first target snapped up at 400 yards, angled sharply against the wind. Ramirez didn't think. She reacted. The crosshairs found center, her breath stilled, and the rifle bucked. Crack, clang. The plate dropped instantly. Gasps, a murmur, then silence. The second target leapt at 600 yards, twisting side on. As the mechanism jerked it upright, Ramirez swung, adjusted holdover, squeezed. Crack. The plate spun, then fell. 2. The third target snapped up almost instantly, the system giving her no pause. 750 yards, the wind cutting hard. She rolled her cheek into the stock, adjusted mid-breath, fired. Crack, clang. Another fall. 3. The murmurs were louder now, impossible to contain. Men who had sworn never to break formation leaned forward, eyes wide. Kane's jaw tightened, his mask of control cracking just slightly at the edges. But Ramirez wasn't finished. The fourth plate appeared, nearly 900 yards. The wind gusted hard, making the target sway. She adjusted for the movement, fired. Crack. The bullet struck dead center. The steel dropped like a stone. 4. The fifth target jumped at 500 yards, peering for only 5 seconds before it would vanish. Ramirez's eyes narrowed. She adjusted fast, her fingers squeezing in rhythm with her pulse. Crack, clang. 5. The crowd couldn't hold back this time. A roar erupted, boots stomping, soldiers shouting. Sergeants tried to shush them, but discipline had fractured completely. Kane's eyes blazed. Ramirez had already matched her perfection once. Now she was repeating it under impossible conditions. The sixth target popped up at 800 yards, the wind pulling crosswise like an unseen hand. Ramirez inhaled, let the world narrow, and pressed the trigger. Crack! The plate dropped with a ringing crash. 6 for 6. Again, the eruption was deafening this time. Soldiers cheered, clapped, some even whistled. It was no longer about Ramirez defying an admiral. It was about witnessing something extraordinary. Ramirez sat up slowly, her rifle resting across her lap, her face still calm. She let the noise wash over her, not feeding it, not dismissing it. Her silence was part of her legend now. Kane stood rigid, every muscle taut. His pride had been tested twice, and twice it had been shattered. Yet even he couldn't deny what he had seen. When the noise finally ebbed, he stepped forward, his voice carrying above the crowd. You've proven your rifle is no trinket. You've proven you are more than a shooter. You've proven you are, he paused, his jaw tight, a marksman of the highest order. A ripple ran through the formation. An admiral's praise wasn't given lightly. But Kane's eyes still burned as he met Ramirez's steady gaze. This isn't over, petty officer. Not yet. And with that, he turned sharply, his coat whipping in the wind, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. The soldiers erupted again once he was gone, voices rising, names shouted, laughter and disbelief, rippling like wildfire. But Ramirez said nothing. She only cleaned her rifle, piece by piece, as though the challenge had been nothing more than routine. For her, it wasn't about the crowd. It wasn't about Kane. It was about the bond between shooter and rifle, unbroken, unshaken, unchallenged. And in that bond, she had already won. The cheers from the range still lingered in the air, echoing down the concrete walls of the training grounds like the aftershock of an explosion. Even as sergeants barked the formation back into order, discipline was fractured. Men grinned when they thought no one was looking. Boots shifted in restless energy, and every whispered glance drifted back to the same figure, Petty Officer Elena Ramirez, sitting cross-legged on the gravel, cleaning her rifle in quiet ritual. The .50 cal lay across her lap, gleaming in the sun, each piece methodically wiped, checked, and returned to place. It was a familiar dance, one she'd performed in desert heat, jungle humidity, and shipboard chaos. To Ramirez, the act wasn't maintenance. It was communion. Every bolt, every spring, Every curve of steel was a reminder of trust. The rifle never failed her if she never failed it. Around her, silence thickened. Not complete silence, not the silence of absence. This was the silence of expectation, of tension strung tight like wire. The men weren't cheering anymore, but their eyes hadn't left her. Even those who tried to stare straight ahead found themselves stealing glances, memorizing the calm rhythm of her hands. They knew a story was forming in front of them, one they would tell in mess halls and barracks for years to come. Captain. Harlow stood at the edge of the formation, arms folded tightly behind his back. His jaw was clenched, but his eyes betrayed relief. Ramirez had not only survived Admiral Kane's gauntlet, she had turned it into a victory so complete it would haunt the Admiral's pride. Still, Harlow's instincts screamed caution. Kane was not finished, not by a long shot. Admiral Kane himself stood a dozen paces away, motionless as a statue, watching Ramirez work. His expression was unreadable, carved marble, all sharp edges and shadows. The bandage on his wrist peeked from under his sleeve, a small but constant reminder of the humiliation he'd suffered when Ramirez had forced his hand away from the rifle. Inside, however, Kane's mind was anything but still. He had seen marksmen. Before, he had seen brilliance, precision, mastery under pressure. But Ramirez had delivered something else entirely. Defiance crystallized into perfection. She hadn't just hit 6 targets. She had done it twice, under conditions designed to break her. And she had done it without theatrics, without ego, without even acknowledging the crowd. That restraint unsettled him more than her skill. Had she celebrated, he could have dismissed her as arrogant. Had she faltered, he could have buried her career. But she had done neither. Instead, she stood in absolute control, as though the rifle were not a weapon, but an extension of her body, as natural as her heartbeat. And worse, his men had seen it. He could feel the shift rippling through the ranks. Respect, once unquestioningly, his by virtue of stars on his shoulders, was now divided. They would still salute him, obey him, march under his orders, but part of their admiration now leaned toward Ramirez, toward the soldier who had stared down power and won. Kane's lips pressed thin. This wasn't just about a rifle anymore. This was about authority. The range grew still again as Ramirez finished reassembling her weapon. She ran a final cloth down the length of the barrel, then locked the bolt back with a solid click. Only then did she look up, scanning the line of soldiers, the officers, the waiting silence. Her eyes finally landed on Kane. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The calm in her gaze said everything. I am ready. Whatever comes next, I am ready. Kane stepped forward, boots grinding into the gravel. The crowd stiffened automatically, the ripple of his authority still powerful, despite the crack in its foundation. He stopped a few feet from Ramirez and stared down at her. Petty officer, he said at last, his voice carrying. You've proven your skill. Twice. But I don't give respect easily, and I don't give it because of a performance. Ramirez's head tilted slightly, but she stayed silent. Kane continued, his tone growing sharper. Respect, in my world, comes from more than skill. It comes from loyalty, from discipline, from knowing when to follow orders and when to keep your place. The soldiers tensed. They knew what he was doing, framing the narrative so that, no matter how flawless Ramirez's shooting had been, she was still in the wrong for her earlier defiance. Ramirez rose smoothly to her feet, the rifle slung over her shoulder with practiced ease. She stood at attention, her posture as rigid as any on the parade ground. But her eyes, steady, unflinching, never wavered from his. With respect, Admiral, she said, her voice calm but firm, discipline is exactly why I stopped you. A rifle like this is sacred to a marksman. You don't touch another's weapon without permission. That's not arrogance. That's survival. A murmur ran through the ranks. She had said aloud what many believed, but never dared speak. Kane's jaw tightened, but Ramirez pressed on, her voice steady as stone. You ask for loyalty. You ask for respect. I've given both to every superior who's earned it. But respect is a two-way street. If you treat this rifle as a trinket, you treat me as one too. And I won't let that stand. Her words cut like a blade, clean and undeniable. The silence that followed was suffocating. Every soldier stood frozen, breaths held, eyes darting between the two figures locked in a battle of wills. Kane's chest rose and fell slowly. His eyes bored into hers, searching for weakness, for any flicker of fear. But there was none. Ramirez stood unshaken, her words hanging in the air like the echo of a gunshot. For a moment, it seemed the Admiral might lash out. He could strip her rank, crush her career, make her an example of defiance. But deep down, he knew the damage had already been done. The men had seen her mastery. They had heard her words. To crush her now would not restore his authority. It would shatter it further. And so, for the first time that day, Kane said nothing. He turned sharply on his heel, his coat flaring behind him, and walked away. The officers scrambled to follow, but the soldiers remained rooted, their eyes following him until he disappeared beyond the range gates. The silence deepened once more. Ramirez exhaled slowly, adjusting the strap of her rifle. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply lowered her gaze to the weapon on her shoulder and whispered under her breath, words only the rifle could. Here, always us. It was a mantra, a promise, a reminder of the bond that had carried her through battles and now through this storm. The men around her shifted uneasily, still unsure whether to speak, to cheer, to fall back into discipline. But deep down they knew something had changed that day. Admiral Kane still wore his stars. But Ramirez had earned something rarer, something harder to command or manufacture, respect that could not be ordered, only given freely. The storm had not yet broken, but in the silence before it, Ramirez stood unshaken, rifle in hand, already prepared for whatever came next. And the men knew in the marrow of their bones that the legend had only just begun. The storm broke. The training range had been reset, but this time it wasn't just a test, it was a crucible. 6 fresh steel plates had been erected at uneven intervals, stretching from 300 yards to nearly a mile. They gleamed in, the harsh afternoon light swaying faintly in the ocean wind. No one spoke as Ramirez approached the line. Boots crunched in rhythm, her shadow long across the gravel. She lowered herself into the prone position, her rifle settling on its bipod, as naturally as if the earth itself had been built for it. The crowd of soldiers leaned forward in perfect unison, their discipline frayed to its breaking point. They were no longer watching a drill. They were watching history. At the edge of the formation, Admiral Kane stood like a dark figure carved. From stone, arms crossed, expression unreadable. But in his eyes burned a sharp fire, part anger, part something harder to name. The range officer raised his hand, voice cracking against the silence. Shooter ready? Ramirez's cheek pressed into the stock. Her breathing slowed. Her heartbeat steadied. Shooter ready. Fire when ready. The world narrowed into a tunnel. Ramirez's focus locked through the scope on the first target, the nearest plate, 300 yards. Child's play for a marksman, but there was no such thing as easy in front of an admiral at an entire base. She exhaled, let her lungs empty, and squeezed. Crack! The rifle thundered, a shockwave rolling down the line. A half-second later, clang. The steel rang and toppled into the dirt. The formation twitched, the crowd suppressing the instinct to cheer. "One," Ramirez murmured under her breath, reloading in a smooth motion. The second plate stood at 450 yards, angled slightly to the left. The wind teased its edge, tugging her bullet's path before it had even left the barrel. Ramirez adjusted instinctively, her fingers stroking the trigger as if coaxing the shot into being. Crack! The round streaked, invisible but deadly. A metallic crash followed, the plate slamming to the ground. 2. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a collective breath released all at once. Kane's jaw tightened, though his expression didn't break. The third plate shimmered in the distance. At 600 yards, the air between distorted by heat waves. The mirage danced, bending light, threatening to warp her aim. Ramirez steadied her breathing. She didn't fight the shimmer. She looked through it. The crosshairs floated where her mind told her the plate truly stood. Crack, a beat. Then clang. The target folded. 3. This time, the murmur swelled louder. Shoulders shook with suppressed excitement, eyes wide, discipline cracking under the weight of awe. Ramirez didn't notice. Her world was still the scope, the wind, the steel. The fourth plate stood at 750 yards. Smaller, meaner. The crosswind here was vicious, dragging grasses sideways, carrying salt off the sea. Ramirez dialed for drift, adjusted holdover, and stilled herself. She pulled. Crack. The plate rang, dropped. 4. The formation buzzed like a hive. Some soldiers clenched fists silently. Others bit their lips to hide grins. They weren't just witnessing skill. They were witnessing perfection made flesh. The fifth plate was brutal. 800 yards. Narrow. The wind shifting erratically. Ramirez's finger hovered, waiting for the gusts to align. Her lungs emptied, her heartbeat slowed, her world compressed to the size of a coin. The trigger broke. Crack! The bullet. Carried, dragged slightly sideways by a stubborn gust. For a split second, it looked like it might miss. Clang. The steel fell, ringing loud enough to make soldiers flinch in disbelief. 5. This time, shears broke through despite Sergeant's efforts. Boots stomped, whispers hissed. It was impossible to contain the surge of adrenaline. Kane's arms tightened across his chest. His bandaged wrist pulsed with heat. His authority, once unquestioned, was being rewritten before his very eyes. The sixth plate loomed at nearly 1,000 yards. The hardest, the farthest. The shot that separated. Marksman from legends. The wind howled downrange, tugging grass flat against the earth. The plate swayed ever so slightly, a pendulum against the horizon. Ramirez exhaled slowly. She could feel every beat of her heart, every hair on her skin. Around her, the world. Dissolved, the soldiers, the Admiral, the base itself. There was only her, the rifle, and the target waiting across the void. Her finger eased pressure onto the trigger. Her lungs emptied. The crosshairs drifted, held, stilled. Crack! The rifle bucked into her shoulder, thunder rolling down the line. Through the scope, she saw the plate shiver. Then, clang. It toppled. Steel collapsing into dirt. 6 for 6. Again, the eruption was deafening. Discipline shattered. Soldiers roared, some clapping, some stomping boots, others shouting Ramirez's name like a chant. Their voices filled the range, echoing into the sky, a sound that was half celebration and half revolution. Ramirez sat up slowly, her rifle resting across her lap, face calm as ever. She didn't pump her fist. She didn't grin. She simply ran her hand along the barrel, feeling the heat fade, the metal humming faintly like a living thing. The cheers thundered around her, but she stayed still, her silence more powerful than any boast. At the edge of the crowd, Kane didn't move. His face was a mask, his eyes like coals, hot, furious, yet edged with something else. Respect, reluctant, grudging, unavoidable. When the noise finally ebbed, Kane stepped forward. The soldiers fell silent almost instantly, as though his authority still lingered even in the shadow of Ramirez's triumph. He stopped in front of her, his voice low but sharp. 6 shots. 6 drops. Again. He paused, scanning her face. His jaw tight. You've made your point, petty officer. More than once. Ramirez met his gaze evenly. She didn't nod. She didn't bow. She simply held his stare. Kane's eyes flicked to the rifle, then back to her. That rifle is yours, and yours alone. No one touches it again. The soldiers around them shifted, glancing at each other. They had heard the words. They understood what they meant. The Admiral wasn't just conceding a point. He was acknowledging her claim. Ramirez saluted crisply. Yes, sir. Kane held her eyes a moment longer, then turned sharply on his heel. His coat snapped in the wind as he strode away, officers scrambling to follow. As his figure disappeared, the crowd broke once more into cheers, this time unrestrained. Soldiers surged forward, clapping Ramirez on the shoulder, some even bowing their heads in respect. But Ramirez said nothing. She only rose to her feet, rifle slung over her shoulder, and walked slowly off the range. The storm had passed, the silence broken, and the legend sealed in steel and smoke. 6 shots, 6 drops. A story that would echo in every barracks, every mess hall, every deployment where soldiers spoke of respect, pride, and the bond between a warrior and her rifle. The range was quiet now. The wind rustled the flags, carrying the faint salt tang of the sea across the gravel. Gravel still bore the marks of spent rounds, the divots where steel had fallen, and the footprints of soldiers who had watched history unfold. Petty Officer Elena Ramirez stood at the center of it all, rifle slung across her shoulder, face calm as ever. She moved slowly, methodically, as if savoring the moment, though no one could mistake her calm for indifference. Every soldier in the formation, hundreds of eyes, followed her movements, their respect palpable. Captain Harlow approached cautiously, adjusting his uniform, hands clasped behind his back. His eyes softened as he studied her. Petty officer, he said quietly. I don't think anyone could have expected. Ramirez glanced at him briefly, a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging his words. She didn't need to explain herself. The work had spoken for her. Her skill, her composure, her courage had done what words could never achieve. Behind her, Admiral Kane's boots crunched across the gravel. He moved differently now, slower, more deliberate. No swagger, no edge of superiority. He stopped. A few feet away, bandaged wrist flexing faintly, eyes fixed on Ramirez. He cleared his throat. Petty Officer Ramirez. Her posture stiffened automatically, a soldier's reflex, even as she met his gaze evenly. You've demonstrated skill beyond any I've seen in my career. Not only that, you've shown something rarer. His voice softened slightly, carrying not the sharpness of command, but the weight of acknowledgement. Courage, discipline, precision, and integrity. Ramirez inclined her head slightly, her expression still composed. Thank you, sir, she said simply. No flourish, no arrogance. Just respect returned where it was due. The crowd shifted. Soldiers whispered, some audibly, some only in the tension of exhale. Kane's words weren't merely praise. They were a public recognition, a formal acknowledgement of her standing. Among these men and women, Ramirez had claimed not just victory on the range, but a place in the history of the base. Kane continued, no one touches your rifle. Not today. Not ever. And that includes me. The statement landed like a hammer on an anvil. Soldiers exchanged glances, almost unable to process it. The Admiral had ceded ground, publicly, and he had done so because Ramirez had earned it, fair and square. For a moment, silence fell. Then it rippled through the ranks like a current. Boots shifted. A few soldiers dared smiles. Others clenched fists quietly in triumph, honoring both the performance and the principle behind it. Ramirez lowered her rifle, resting it gently on the ground. She moved with deliberate calm, returning the weapon to her kit. Every action was precise, measured, and full of ritualistic care, as if she were offering a silent vow to the instrument. That had protected her, and by extension, the lives of those around her. Captain Harlow approached again, this time with a soft, incredulous laugh. "I think it's safe to say, petty officer, you've become something of a legend today." Ramirez offered a slight nod, eyes glinting with the faintest hint of pride. "I'm just doing my duty, sir." The Admiral's eyes flicked toward the line of soldiers, then back to her. "Duty," he said slowly, "has never looked so precise." The words carried weight. Kane had never been one to hand out praise lightly, and yet here it was, the rare acknowledgement of true merit. The soldiers began to file past Ramirez, some offering quiet congratulations, others clapping on her shoulder, a few bowing their heads in respect. Every gesture reinforced the truth that had been demonstrated on that range. This was a soldier who demanded respect through action, not ceremony, who enforced her principles without arrogance, and who had, in a single afternoon, earned the admiration of those who had watched in silence, skepticism, and awe. Ramirez accepted their gestures with quiet grace, never letting her expression waver. She knew the value of her actions wasn't in applause or attention. It was in the principle, defending what was hers, and honoring the weapon that had saved her countless times. Admiral Kane finally spoke again, addressing the entire formation now. His voice was firm, carrying across the gravel and flags. "Let this be a lesson," he said, tone unwavering but edged with newfound respect. "Skill matters. Discipline matters. But above all, integrity matters." And today, Petty Officer Ramirez has exemplified all three. I would be honored to have her on my team in the field. A ripple of stunned acknowledgement ran through the soldiers. Kane rarely allowed himself to display respect so openly. This was remarkable. And the admiration in the formation was no longer quiet. Shouts of approval and nods of acknowledgement spread like wildfire. Even Harlow allowed himself a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "I don't think anyone here will ever forget this day." Ramirez finally slung her rifle over her shoulder. She walked toward the edge of the range, boots crunching against gravel, head held high. Around her, whispers swirled into stories that would be told and retold. How she had snapped the Admiral's hand, how she had taken 6 impossible shots, and how she had maintained her composure throughout the ordeal. But Ramirez paid them no mind. She had never sought legend. She had sought respect, earned not through rank or title, but through action. And today she had achieved it. The wind tugged at her hair, carrying the scent of the sea and the sharp tang of gunmetal. She inhaled, feeling the weight of her rifle, of her accomplishments, and of the eyes of every soldier who had witnessed her moment of truth. And in that inhalation, there was clarity. The bond between her and her rifle, forged in countless battles and tests, was unbroken, stronger than ever. Even Admiral Kane lingered at the back of the formation for a long moment, watching her leave. He was quiet, contemplative. Pride warred with frustration in his chest. Frustration that a petty officer had not only challenged him, but bested. Expectations he hadn't known he held. He flexed his bandaged wrist again, rubbing it lightly. He didn't begrudge the pain. He didn't begrudge her defiance, because he understood now Ramirez had done more than defend her rifle. She had reminded everyone present, including him, what it meant to honor one's duty and one's principles without compromise. Kane's eyes softened ever so slightly. He had been tested as much as she had, and in that test he had found respect, genuine, earned, and undeniable. The soldiers began to disperse, talking animatedly, replaying each shot, each click of the rifle, the snap of the Admiral's hand, the calm precision of Ramirez's actions. The legend was born not in story alone, but in the awe of witnesses, who understood they had seen excellence tempered with principle. Ramirez remained for a moment longer, staring at the 6 steel plates now scattered across the range. She knelt, gently tracing her gloved fingers over one of the fallen targets, offering silent acknowledgement for its role in proving her worth. Then she stood, and with her rifle on her shoulder, head held high, she walked from the range, leaving behind a story that would echo through the ranks for years to come. A story of skill, courage, and unshakable principle. 6 shots, 6 drops. A career defined not by orders, not by rank, but by mastery, integrity, and respect earned the hard way. And in the quiet aftermath, every soldier knew one thing: Petty Officer Elena Ramirez would never be forgotten.